proclamation by His Excellency the Governor-General of Australia. On the same the proposed law with or without amendments made.
The stage is set for one of the most bitter elections in Australia's history, following the dismissal of Mr Whitlam, the installation of Mr Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister, and the double dissolution of federal Parliament. The Secretary to the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, proclaimed the official dissolution of Parliament.
He has worn the admonition of the Labor Party.
Order.
He did it for one reason: he deceived his Prime Minister.
Paul Keating was elected to the nation's top job. The Republican debate has moved into top gear.
The seeds for this convention were sown by none other than Sir John Kerr.
Nothing will ever kill off the Republic question. Nothing will kill it off until it is achieved. The vast majority of Australians now are Republicans.
We're thrilled that the No case has won a resounding victory.
Very nice to meet you as well. Sorry about the slight change of plan there, but I think we've come to this order. Lady Deane, the flag. Deputy last one. How do you do? Cast Dugdale. Lady Dugdale, Lady Deane.
Governor-General of Australia, Your Majesty.
Good morning.
Your Majesty.
Very nice to see you.
Lovely to see you.
When did you arrive?
We came from Gallipoli on Anzac.
Oh, you've done Gallipoli.
Yes, which was really wonderful. And we've hardly stopped since.
It's I've done it once.
But not on Anzac Day.
Not on Anzac Day. I didn't. I mean, it was bad enough doing it when I did it.
Well, this was wonderful. There were 7,000 Australians and New Zealanders there.
It's a wonderful pilgrimage.
5,000 would have been young backpackers, and they were wonderful.
I've just seen quite a lot of Australians in Korea who'd gone back to do a sort of tour of the battlefields. Extraordinary, isn't it?
We are in a bit of a twilight zone at the moment. Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Australia, regards herself quite correctly as the head of state of Australia. Her website says so. Yet we have this office, this Indigenous office, embedded in the Australian Constitution, who discharges most but not all of the functions of a head of state. And this, of course, raises, I think, constitutionally silly propositions that we have two heads of state or that we have 1.5 heads of state. I think that's an issue that will have to be resolved in the longer term, and it's hard to see that it's going to be resolved in any other way than Australia eventually adopting some republican form of government. It was interesting that when Paul Keating first started this ball rolling some time ago, he did not propose that Australia be referred to as the Republic of Australia. He said it was to be the Commonwealth of Australia, which is what it currently is. I can see no reason why you couldn't retain the title Governor-General. That then does away with any confusion that might be in the minds of some voters that we're moving towards some American model.
He's the Queen's representative but there are many powers and responsibilities directly vested in him. But I myself think that the essential role of the Governor-General, and I've used this phrase before, is the role of interpreting the nation to itself. By that I mean that he's a symbol of unity in the nation, and he speaks and travels. And I think that his speeches and his travelling are the most important aspect of his life and work, because it's in that way that he achieves what I've tried to describe as the interpreting the nation to itself.
Sir William Deane was a Justice of the High Court until his appointment as Governor-General of Australia by Prime Minister Paul Keating in February 1996. This, his first official overseas visit, is to Turkey to commemorate the Anzac Day dawn service at Gallipoli.
Your address follows Major Munchenberg, who's doing a reading from Ataturk, the second reading.
Above all else, I think the useful role that a Governor-General plays in that sense is adding importance to the occasion. Not because the Governor-General is terribly important, but rather because attending any of the innumerable functions that one does attend, and particularly in years like the bicentennial celebrations, gave to the occasion a particular sense of importance and solemnity. So I think that was a useful role.
The 1999 Anzac Day Dawn Service Address will be delivered by His Excellency, the Honourable Sir William Deane, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia.
Just before dawn, on that first Anzac Day, 84 years ago, the boats carrying the 1,500 men who would make the first landing were moving through darkness towards these shores. All was silent, save for whispers of apprehension and the quiet splash of oars. Ahead of them, two searchlights briefly penciled the sky, then disappeared. Still silence. The leading boats touched the beach. The first Anzacs leaped out. A yellow beacon flared to the south and a single shot was heard. Then several more. And as the boats further out came in, the fire broke out upon them from the heights above us. The silence and the waiting were over. And the key, as one of the Anzacs was later to say, was turned in the lock of hell.
Whereabouts do you think? I think just here.
That concludes the official wreath laying ceremony.
Anzac is a sacred place of our nation, and that Anzac Day was going to be the last on which the Anzac service was held in the cemetery down on Anzac Cove. It seemed to me to be important to be there, and it was, as it turned out, one of the most memorable experiences of my life. I wasn't surprised by the number of Australians at Gallipoli because I'd been led to expect that. I was surprised by the numbers of young Australians, and I must say I was quite overwhelmed by the spirit of the place.
Just 14 years before the Anzac landings, on the 1st of January 1901, the Australian nation came into existence. A federation not unlike that of the United States of America, and with a written constitution. Under the constitution, the country was to be governed by a federal parliament, which consisted of the British Queen, then Queen Victoria, a Senate and a House of Representatives. A constitutional monarchy that was a unique combination of Westminster and Washington.
I think that each Governor-General has to bring elements of their own character, their own personality, their own perception of, within the strictures of course of the Constitution, their own perception of the continuing evolution of the office of Governor-General. That's one of the things I think that has proved to be such a uniquely Australian aspect to this office. It's an office that has evolved with us as we've moved through the last century.
People who were appointed to the office, of course, were the same sorts of people who were appointed colonial governors. They were retired English conservative and sometimes liberal politicians, or British retired military, usually naval officers. Now, they came to that office with a conception of what a colonial governor did, which was not what was in the Constitution. Now, over time, if you like, their theory of colonial governorship was overtaken by the reality of the Australian Constitution, but it took some time for it to occur.
It was not until 1931 that the first Australian-born Governor-General was appointed, our 9th Governor-General, Sir Isaac Isaacs.
I was the author of a life of Isaac Isaacs, and when I knew that I was to be Governor-General, that's to say when I met the Prime Minister early in 1977, one of the first things that came into my head, and I was pretty confused, hearing that I was to be Governor-General, was to think that I was Isaac's biographer. That's to say, it was accidental. I never assumed in 1,000 years that I would be Governor-General. Who does? I would often think, as I sat in my chair in my study, this is where Isaacs sat and this is where Isaacs worked. And I would think about him from time to time in this way.
Isaacs, a distinguished lawyer, was a Jewish Australian, and at a time of rising anti-Semitism in Europe, his name was met with some consternation by the King.
In the past, it was accepted that the Australian Prime Minister would recommend a short list of names, and those names were often recommended to him by the British Colonial Office, and then a British minister would put advice to the British monarch, who would then appoint a person. Now, James Scullin, the Labor Prime Minister in England for a imperial conference, simply put forward Sir Isaac Isaacs' name and said, this will be the person who will be appointed. Now, that was significant in two respects. One, that he gave the King no discretion, about which the King was much displeased, but nevertheless acted on the Prime Minister's advice, which was a second and important precedent. And thirdly, of course, Isaac Isaacs was the first Australian-born Governor-General.
The first Governors-General resided at Government House, Melbourne. The Federal Parliament, too, resided in Melbourne until 1927. It was then that the rambling sheep station Yarralumla was brought into commission as the official vice-regal residence in the nation's new capital, Canberra.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. That is, those of you who have got seats. First of all, can I say how very welcome you all are to Yarralumla. I'd like to say how especially welcome all those are who are being sworn in today, either as ministers or as members of the Executive Council. Earlier this afternoon, I invited Mr Howard to accept reappointment as Prime Minister and to form the second Howard Ministry. He accepted the invitation. After some persuasion. And I immediately executed the formal instrument appointing him as Prime Minister of Australia.
I, John Winston Howard, do swear that I will well and truly serve the people of Australia in the office of Prime Minister, and that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, so help me God.
Under the Constitution, the Governor-General is the Queen's representative in Australia. But it is a unique role, with powers that the monarch herself does not have. Only the Governor-General can appoint and dismiss ministers. The Governor-General is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, yet of course in practice never acts except on the advice of his ministers. In truth, most of what a Governor-General does is ceremonial, such as the swearing in of ministers and the opening of Parliament.
On the 3rd of October, the Australian people re-elected the government and renewed its responsibility for managing the nation's affairs in the interests of all Australians. The powers of government which a Governor-General exercises are, by and large, all exercised on advice, that is, advice by the Prime Minister or advice by the responsible minister. On the one hand, there are some quite exceptional circumstances in which theoretically a Governor-General can exercise powers of government independently of advice. They're the circumstances in which what we call the reserve powers may come into play. They're very rare. In my case, there hasn't even been a case approaching the need to consider exercising reserve powers, and I don't think there will be. The other qualification is a much more important practical one, and that is that any powers of persuasion which a Governor-General seeks to exercise must be confined to matters which don't take him or her into partisan or politics or political controversy.
In the most controversial act in the history of the office, Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed Prime Minister Whitlam on the 11th of November 1975. The Prime Minister had gone to Government House to request a half-Senate election. He was shown into the Governor-General's study. Without warning, Kerr did what no British monarch has done in 200 years. He sacked a Prime Minister who still enjoyed the confidence of Parliament. Many Australians condemned Kerr's actions as politically partisan. There is no doubt that the office of Governor-General would never be the same again.
Well may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
To some extent, I think Governors-General step back from day-to-day politics. I think the great difficulty that John Kerr had was precisely doing that. He had been involved very much in the great struggles in Australian politics, particularly within the Labor Party in the 50s and the 60s. He'd been involved as a barrister in many of the very important union battles that went through the courts at that time. And he had a position within that set of struggles, and it was a position that many within the Labor Party were very aware of and very wary of. And I think his difficulty was that when he came to what ought to have been a distanced position from everyday politics, he found that extremely difficult. It wasn't what he was used to, and it wasn't something that came naturally to him.
I think Governor-General Kerr's grave constitutional error, he made a number, but the gravest of them, was not to warn his Prime Minister that dismissal was an option. And Governor-General Kerr made a political decision. His political decision was that the Senate would stand firm and that supply would not be passed, and that would be injurious to the country. Now, whether he was right or wrong, he made a political decision, not a constitutional one.
Executive power of government is formally exercised by the Governor-General through the Federal Executive Council. This body consists of the Governor-General and at least 2 ministers.
Come in.
Governor-General,
Good morning. Morning, Governor-General. Nice to see you. Mr. Slipper, nice to see you again. Please sit down. Thank you. Kevin? All right, are we ready to start? I declare this meeting of the Federal Executive Council open.
We've got a big one for next time for the administrator.
All laws and many other matters of government must be approved by the Federal Executive Council and then signed into law by the Governor-General. Although this is generally seen as a formality, His Excellency must content himself that what he is asked to do is lawful, and he may ask for clarification of some matter or further information, although such requests would be rare.
I haven't substituted the... I've got the original of that. Do you want me to get it while in your presence, or...? No, I've got it in my file.
Right. Well, as long as you can make sure the page is substituted.
Yep.
Yeah.
These are the rubber stamp protocols of government.
Rubber stamps are quite useful, constantly employed, and there is a lot of rubber stamping that goes on, but there's very much more than that. I think I've always thought of it as representing Australia to Australians and also, I suppose, to the world. When I was Governor-General, I travelled to, I think, about 17 countries overseas, and always in that role.
This is the first trip overseas for Sir William Deane as Governor-General, although he has at this time been in the job for more than 3 years. Surprisingly, it is the first time an Australian Governor-General has officially visited Ireland. Sir William is greeted by the Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, but it is the President, Mary McAleese, who will host her Australian counterpart. It is on official occasions such as this state dinner in his honour at Dublin Castle that the Governor-General is received as if he were Australia's head of state. Yet even so, the toast is to Her Majesty the Queen.
May I ask all of you please to stand with me and to toast the Queen and the people of Australia.
In a novel step, and one which monarchists might see as worrying, this Governor-General has overseen a change to the loyal toast to include the words, "and the people of Australia."
Well, I think one of the classic cases is when Bill Hayden was Governor-General and the government arranged an official visit to some newly independent previous Soviet republics. And when they were carrying out the government-to-government negotiations for the details of the visit, the governments of two of those republics contacted the British government asking did Mr Hayden have their permission, which created great embarrassment at their end, and they had to try to explain, well, it had nothing to do with us, but the people at the other end are saying, but isn't he the representative of your monarch? To which they have to say, well, yes, but no. I mean, there really is that's the constitutional twilight zone that we're in.
It's been an extraordinary pleasure for us to renew not only acquaintanceship but true friendship with the President and her husband. In this job, one meets many people. It's only occasionally that one knows that a friendship that has been formed is going to last long after the job. And I can say to the President and Dr. McAleese that's certainly the case so far as we're concerned in the relationship that's developed between us.
It will be probably the people rather than the places that will make this visit very special for you and for Lady Helen. And I hope that both of you will leave here with warm and lasting memories of your time here, just as I did from my visit to Australia. I have memories of places that will never be erased from my mind, but I have in particular memories of people. And I also have, as you remarked, the great gift of enduring friendships that were so easily made, relationships that were so easily to intersect and create. I was very captivated by something that caught my attention during the week that the new Foreign Minister of Lebanon is also part Irish and indeed shares, like Sir William, shares antecedents from Tipperary. So I don't know what it is about Tipperary, but it produces people who, no matter where they go in the world, they go straight to the top, straight to the top. But I have no doubt that when you visit your own ancestral home in County Tipperary tomorrow, it will be a formidable day for you, I have no doubt. It'll be a day when the heartstrings are really strongly pulled and our hearts go with you on that journey.
Well, my great-grandfather left in 1850.
1850, yes. Yes, he probably would have gone to Mass in the old church here.
For sure.
In the old church here, yes. Maybe in his young days he might have gone to the church in Palace.
Children.
Yes, it is.
They're wonderful.
Hello, you're very welcome.
Thank you. You all.
I am married to a dean. No.
Huh?
I don't really know if
They're
there's
popping up
connection.
everywhere.
I'm just so good to meet you, and I'm delighted.
Well, nobody's
You've married
perfect,
a dean too. I have a dean, yeah. We have something in common.
This is the other dean.
This is the other dean. How are you?
Hello, you're a Kennedy, are you? There are a lot of Kennedys around here, aren't there? And you a Kennedy? And another Kennedy? Great.
Fine, Bernie. Head pub on a cap. Head pub on a cap.
You're welcome in for a pint now. Welcome home, William. Thank you very much. So nice. You invite me in for a pint.
And you born? I was born 13 miles away from here, but I've been stationed here now for 16 years.
But Tipperary born?
No, Galway, just across the Shannon. What's your name? And what's your second name? And how old are you? Oh, you got a cold. What's your name? Koala bear?
The reaction of people at every level was absolutely wonderful, particularly the people down in Tipperary, where my great-great-grandfather came from all those years ago. The Irish people are tremendously conscious of the closeness between Australia and Ireland. It's a country with which Australia has the deepest ties. Indeed, a third of Australians roughly claim some Irish descent.
That'll do, I think the boys are. No, we'll do it properly. Well done. Well done.
And you'll leave it closed. Leave it closed, yeah.
British imperial honours such as MBEs, OBEs and knighthoods are no longer awarded by any Australian government. Since 1975, we have had our own system of Australian honours and awards.
Now, the order that you're in, you need to remember and is important, because if you get the order absolutely wrong, you end up picking up something the wrong insignia altogether. And basically the afternoon flows through the, there's a seniority of the order and alphabetical order within that.
Within the Order of Australia, to be appointed as a companion in the General Division, Karine Fitzgerald, for service to the community through commitment and support for Australian medical research into sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. Karine Fitzgerald. Dr. Luicha O'Donoghue, for public service through leadership to Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in the areas of human rights and social justice, particularly as chairperson of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission. Dr. Luicha O'Donoghue. Yes, the current one, I think William Deane, you don't get much better. I think he's part of the evolution of the office. Traditionalists of the 50s would be, I think, uneasy about the fact that recent Governors-General will speak on national issues, be those national issues gap between rich and poor, plight of Aboriginal health, and so on. In the past, Governors-General tended not to do that, whereas the office, like all offices, changes. And we now don't get upset if William Deane makes pronouncements about Aboriginal health or whatever, because they're clearly non-partisan. I mean, he's not barracking for one side or the other. And people, I think, maybe because they now at the moment have such a low opinion of politicians, quite like to see a person whom they probably perceive as the head of state making those sorts of pronouncements.
Well done, very fast. Will can barely move.
Sir William has come to Central Australia to make 2 land handbacks. The first is to the Tempe Downs Middleton Ponds community. he will deliver a deed of grant to the Arumpi Iltanjari Aboriginal Land Trust on behalf of the traditional owners.
I've endeavoured on a number of occasions to encourage reconciliation and to emphasise what I see as the three strands of our national identity, which really unify and sustain our nation. Those three strands are what I call the spirit of Anzac, our multicultural inclusiveness, and the generosity and sense of fair play that so commonly exists between ordinary Australians.
After a successful claim under the Land Rights Act, the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, or a representative of the Minister, will usually make the handover. But this is a special occasion, and the Governor-General has decided to personally deliver the deeds. These areas are among the last large areas to be returned in this way. Sir William is greeted by Max Stewart, the Chairman of the Central Land Council, Tracker Tilmouth, Director, and Land Council lawyer Tony Keys.
A while since I last saw you.
Well, you must feel awfully healthy for it.
Tony Keys. Tony, nice to meet you.
The essence of a democracy is government for the people. And in a democracy, normally, the strong and the powerful can look after themselves. It's the weak and the disadvantaged who really set the tone, and their treatment seems to me to constitute the measure of the worth of a democracy such as Australia.
The ceremonies to be conducted here and later at Central Mount Wedge are sacred. Only a handful of white people have been honoured with a performance. The fight to regain their lands by owners and elders such as Kunmanyara Braden and Sid Coulthard stretches back to the early 1970s and before.
We are battling through, struggling through it from ever since 79, all the way along. Get a lot of problem with station manager. Nearly get shot or poisoning the water, well, chasing with a couple of choppers, kids, you know. And all that problem we've been having through 79 and come to Haiti. We had a lot of problem with the wells, like water. They come along with bulldozer, bury them. And we start digging again, sockages, you know, and still we go ahead. But we never do any harm, just staying in our country.
I think it's lovely. Everybody's happy for doing woman culture, dancing, and all. Those ladies, we got to come, our aunties from Takariba, to give us hand and sing for us and join in with us and dance. That's very good. I think it's really topped everything up.
Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. And song we were doing is Orambi and Ilijari.
Well, thank you for it very much. It was great.
We had the Governor-General now take time out
to turn up today to officiate and hand over on behalf of the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, the government and the Prime Minister. I suppose you're still his boss, aren't you? Yeah, we're not a republic yet. So on behalf of the Central Land Council and the Chairman of the Central Land Council, I now call on William Deane. I keep thinking you're back in the High Court. And there was early days when things were quite good. So I call on the Governor-General to make a speech. Right, all yours. Thanks, mate.
First of all, let me acknowledge all the traditional owners, all the language groups. The modern Aboriginal land rights movement had its beginnings in 1966 when Vincent Lingiari led his people off Wave Hill Station on strike. It was in 1974 that the then Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Whitlam, went to Dagaruggu, the Gurindji land, and there participated in a ceremony whereby he delivered to the Gurindji people a leasehold title of part of their land. In the course of that ceremony, the Prime Minister took a handful of soil and poured it into the hands of Vincent Lingiari as a symbolic gesture, handing over the land. Vincent Lingiari spoke a few words in English. "We're all mates now," he said. He then turned and addressed the Gurindji people in their language. And what he said was, "Let us live together with non-Indigenous Australians, with non-Aborigines, as friends and true equals."
You put your hand out, you might be getting
all in one hand.
24 hours after visiting Tempe Downs, Sir William is at Central Mount Wedge to deliver a deed of grant to the Nalachu Aboriginal Land Trust on behalf of the traditional owners.
The history of these lands is a rather sad one. Close by was the site of the Coniston Massacre, as it's called, and indeed one of the oldest of the traditional owners can remember what the Aborigines call the killing time. Well, now, it's in that context that one can really only marvel at the generosity of spirit with which they've come to have this ceremony. They've invited us to participate in it, and they've shown us extraordinary goodwill on every side.
Governor General, Sir William, you come and meet him,
I think Australians generally are beginning to understand the very special relationship between our Aboriginal peoples and their lands. It's quite different, really, from ordinary European notions of ownership.
Thank you for the dance.
Thank you for the dance, Rita.
I'm Rita now.
It was wonderful.
Yes, it's Canberra.
To a large extent, the land owns its Aboriginal custodians and guardians, and they're more its servants in terms of their traditions, their ceremonies, and their songs than they are its masters. Your dance was beautiful. Good. Thank you for the dance.
Mary Nangara.
Mary, nice to meet you.
Yeah.
And your...
Maggie Nangara.
Thank you for the dance.
And how do you feel about the ability of Australians generally to put that past behind them and move forward?
Well, we can't put the past behind us. The past is never gone. It stays to shape what we are and what we will be. But I think Australians generally are facing up to the past now, and the impression I have overwhelmingly from wherever I go in Australia is on all sides there's a genuine desire for true reconciliation between Indigenous Australians and the nation of which they form such an extraordinarily important part.
Sir Zelman Cowan was appointed Governor-General after the departure of Sir John Kerr in 1977. Kerr had been the focus of frequent bitter demonstrations after his actions in 1975, and his replacement was much anticipated.
When my appointment was announced, but before I actually took up office, I was asked what I hoped to do. And I plucked a phrase out of the air. I said, I hope that I might bring a touch of healing. In saying it, I was conscious of the divisions and the unhappiness in the nation. And I wanted to say that I thought that the healing of that was a most appropriate and a most important activity for the Governor-General. A Governor-General acts on advice on virtually all issues. But that doesn't really mean that he's a bland fool. He's got a wonderful opportunity to say and to do things that are, I hope, useful and thoughtful and generate thought in others.
I think the Governor-General represents the nation at large, which is something that is absent of all political tinges. I think the only ones that I knew relatively well, Paul Hasluck, John Kerr, and of course Sir Zelman, who I've known for 40 years, I suppose. And the pattern they set of activity in the Australian community as Australians themselves, I think certainly influenced me. In fact, the hectic routine that Sir Zelman adopted set almost a challenge for me following on immediately after him. His considerable work, I think, in restoring respect for the office after the difficult years of Sir John Kerr.
Every time we've been through the airport, Goss been sitting there either in a car or
The Honourable Justice Kirby and Mr. Van Bolton.
Very nice to see you.
So he was heading just escorting
Wonderful night to play with Mrs. Fraser. Sir, wonderful to see you.
This dinner to honour Sir Zelman has brought together Gough Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser and Sir John Kerr's official secretary, Sir David Smith. And just a few paces across the hall is the study where Whitlam was deposed.
Perhaps one of the ironies of John Kerr's actions in 1975 is the office of Governor-General was brought so precipitously to popular awareness. People are suddenly aware, perhaps more so than previously, of the very real powers that can attach and can be seen to attach to that office. And what that has meant, I think, is that we've become accustomed to the fact that this office exists. There's been a degree of attachment to the people who have filled that office. And we've seen the development of a genuine sense of unity posed by, certainly by the current Governor-General. And I think that with the recent referendum, Republican referendum, there was no real reason to move away from that. And that was one of the issues, I think, that caused some difficulty with the electorate. If we'd proposed, for example, the continuation of the title of Governor-General, the office of Governor-General, but in a new system as the head of state of an Australian Republic, I think there would have been far less questioning of both the nature and the extent of the powers of that office. It allows us to look back to our history, to acknowledge our one-time links with Britain, whilst at the same time recognising that we've evolved a uniquely Australian office that continues into the future as the head of state of an Australian Republic.
Ultimately, there will be once more, perhaps in many years' time, perhaps quite quickly, debate on the question of whether or not there should be a constitutional change to a republic. That in itself, of course, doesn't directly affect the Governor-General until such time as the change is effected. So that I don't see any cataclysmic change likely to occur in the role of the Governor-General in the immediate future.
The fact is that Australia is an independent country. It, to me, makes sense symbolically, that the head of state of Australia should be distinctively an Australian. My general point is that now is the time to start work again. Slowly, carefully, not necessarily conspicuously. It's clear that we've got a great deal of education of the Australian public to achieve. This is not said in any condescending way at all. This is said in a respectful way. But it's clear that there is real ignorance of the Constitution. I hope it isn't invincible ignorance, but I think it's important not to delay, not to make a fuss, a big fuss, but to get on with the work, because this thing will come again. I think that in terms of the question, would you prefer an Australian head of state to the monarch? I think that the answer would be yes in the substantial majority of cases. Now, if that's so, then let's get on with it without hurry, without heat, and do it carefully and well.